For the last 250 years, history has followed a pattern so sharp and so consistent, it has toppled 3 of the most powerful governments on Earth. And every time, the people running those countries never imagined the end was coming. They thought they were safe, untouchable, permanent. They were wrong. And today, in 2025, the United States is facing many of the same pressures, economic, social, and political, that pushed those earlier nations over the edge. Not because history repeats, but because societies under strain tend to break along the same fault lines. To understand why these collapses happen, and why they blindsided the people living through them, you have to look at how revolutions actually unfold. A revolution is not a protest, not an election, not a riot. A revolution is when the old order is swept away, completely replaced by something new, something unpredictable, often something far worse. Revolutions don't start because life is hard. Life has always been hard. They start when a population's expectations rise faster than reality, when people believe they deserve more than what the system can deliver. They start when the gap between the powerful and everyone else becomes so wide that trust snaps. And above all, they start when people stop believing the system can fix itself. John F. Kennedy said it bluntly: "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." History doesn't guarantee that outcome, but it shows how easily societies can slide toward it when they ignore pressure building beneath the surface. France, Russia, Cuba, 3 countries, 3 centuries, 3 completely different cultures. Yet each collapse followed the same basic sequence: 6 stages, moving from inequality to instability to full-scale upheaval. Let's look at how that pattern unfolded, starting with the most famous case of all, the French Revolution. France. 1789. The fall of a superpower in the late 1780s. France was the jewel of Europe. Paris set the standard for culture, art, science, and diplomacy. The monarchy had stood for nearly 800 years. It felt permanent. But underneath that glittering surface, the structure was cracking. Stage 1. Extreme inequality. France's population of 27 million was divided into 3 estates. The clergy 1% paid no taxes. The nobility barely 1% paid almost none. Everyone else, 98% of the country, shouldered the entire tax burden. The nobility lived in luxury. Peasants lived on bread. When a poor harvest sent bread prices soaring, millions couldn't afford to eat. Meanwhile, the elite kept hosting feasts at Versailles. The disconnect was total. Stage 2. Corruption. An incompetent king, Louis XVI, wasn't cruel just. France was bankrupt from wars and bad spending. His solution was to raise taxes on the people who were already starving. The nobility refused to pay their share, blocking every attempt at reform. Instead of working together to save the country, the elites dug in to protect their privileges. Stage 3. The middle class turns in 1789. Louis summoned the Estates General, expecting them to approve new taxes. Instead, the representatives of the Third Estate, the educated middle class, defied him. They declared themselves the National Assembly and demanded a constitution. When the people who are supposed to stabilize the system decide the system is illegitimate, the fuse is lit. Stage 4. Collapse of institutional trust. The Bastille fell. The monarchy's authority evaporated. The church and the courts lost their credibility. Reform came quickly, dramatically, but never fast enough to satisfy a population that no longer trusted the process. Stage 5. Radical momentum. The Jacobin rose. Moderates were swept aside. The call was no longer for reform but for cleansing, purging, remaking society from the ground up. Stage 6. Overthrow and chaos. Louis XVI was executed in 1793. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. Check. This is the tipping point in every historical collapse, and today, large portions of the U.S. population believe elections are untrustworthy, courts are political, media is biased or manipulative, Congress is dysfunctional, federal agencies serve special interests. Once institutions lose legitimacy, people stop believing that reform is possible. They stop believing that peaceful change works, and when belief goes, cooperation goes next. This is the moment when a society becomes vulnerable not because collapse is guaranteed, but because the ground becomes unstable. Stage 5. Movements rise to fill the void. Throughout history, when mainstream institutions falter, new movements, leftist, nationalist, populist, religious, separatist, rush into offer simple explanations and bold promises. In the U.S., we're seeing fragmented versions of this already. Not the disciplined revolutionary parties of France or Russia, but something more diffuse. Online factions, ideological tribes, us versus them, politics, influencers with more power than political leaders, groups promising to restore order or tear everything down. They don't agree with each other, but they agree on one thing: the current system isn't working. Marie Antoinette followed. Then came the reign of terror. 40,000 people executed in a single year. Eventually, even Robespierre, architect of the terror, was swallowed by it. 10 years after it began, France ended up not with liberty or equality, but with Napoleon, a military ruler who launched Europe into more than a decade of war. The lesson: when inequality meets incompetence and institutions lose trust, a society becomes unstable, and what comes after the fall is rarely better. TG2 on government, corruption and incompetence, and check public trust in American institutions has cratered. Confidence in Congress hovers near historic lows. Approval of the Supreme Court has sharply declined. Millions of Americans left, right, and apolitical believe the system is rigged against them. Scandals involving insider trading, corporate influence, and political fundraising only fuel the perception that government serves donors first and citizens second. Gridlock isn't just come on, it's expected. Nothing big gets fixed. Every crisis becomes a partisan fight, and each time Washington fails to act, another layer of trust flakes off. He senses that the system can correct itself is spreading across the political spectrum. Stage 3. Middle class, squeezed and radicalized. Check. Historically, revolutions don't start with the poorest. They start when the middle class feels betrayed. For decades, Americans were told that if they worked hard, they could buy a home, support a family, save for retirement. Now housing is unaffordable in most cities. Student debt crushes young professionals. Healthcare can bankrupt a middle-income household overnight. Wages lag behind inflation. Upward mobility, once the American promise, has stalled, and so the middle class is splitting. Some disengage entirely. Some drift toward populism. Others gravitate toward radical movements on either end of the spectrum. When the people who are supposed to be the backbone of stability lose faith in the system, pressure builds fast. That alone is enough to destabilize a nation. Stage 6. The system fractures. In France, it was the monarchy collapsing. In Russia, the provisional government in Cuba, Batista fleeing overnight. But in the U.S., if a breakdown ever occurred, it would look different. Not a dramatic coup, but a state versus federal conflicts, contested elections, parallel information ecosystems, erosion of norms, rising political violence at the fringes, government paralysis during crisis. This is not destiny. This is not prophecy. History shows patterns, not guarantees, but the pressures that brought past revolutions to the breaking point in corruption, loss of trust, radicalization are pressures the U.S. is undeniably facing. And that's the real lesson of France, Russia, and Cuba. Revolutions don't start when people are suffering. They start when people believe the system can't fix the suffering. Whether a nation collapses or reforms depends on what happens after the warning signs appear, on whether institutions adapt or double down, whether leaders listen or ignore, whether the public chooses engagement or despair. History provides the pattern. What we do with it is up to us. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Lobbyists draft legislation. Corporations bankroll campaigns. Politicians spend more time fundraising than governing. The national debt climbs past $36 trillion. Infrastructure decay, and problems that everyone agrees should be solvable somehow never get solved. Not because solutions don't exist, but because the incentives don't reward them. When voters see both parties as corrupt, compromised, or simply ineffective, faith in democracy erodes. People stop believing in the process, stop believing their voice matters, and stop believing that elections lead to meaningful change. That's how institutional confidence breaks down. Stage 3. Middle class hollowed out and radicalized. The American middle class, once the envy of the world, is under historic pressure. College is unaffordable. Housing costs have exploded. Healthcare expenses can bankrupt even working families. Wages crawl upward while the cost of living sprints ahead. Young people with degrees and debt struggle to afford the life their parents took for granted. Teachers, engineers, nurses, designers, professionals who were supposed to thrive in this system now feel like they're sinking in it. When the people who should be succeeding feel cheated and stuck, they don't drift toward moderation, they drift toward extremes. They look for causes. They look for culprits. They look for answers outside the status quo. This is how revolutions historically begin, not with the poorest, but with the educated who expected better. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. And this is where the United States stands today. Trust in media is scraping the bottom. Trust in police has fractured along political and demographic lines. Trust in elections has collapsed to the point that half the country doubts the results of 2020, while the other half sees January 6th as an attempted coup. Each side believes the other is a threat to the nation. Each side distrusts the systems meant to keep society stable. Courts are seen as political. Federal agencies are accused of bias. Every institution is viewed through a partisan lens. When that happens, a country stops functioning as one nation. It becomes two nations sharing the same borders, waiting for anything to push them into open conflict. In France, it was the Estates General. In Russia, it was Bloody Sunday. In Cuba, it was Batista's repression. In America, the spark could be economic, political, or social. But the deeper point is this. The conditions are dry. What matters isn't the specific match, but the fuel surrounding it. Stage 5. A revolutionary movement gains mass support. We're not fully here yet, but the early signs are unmistakable. On two left, growing interest in socialist ideas, redistributive policies, and eat the rich rhetoric. On the right, increasing attraction to strongman politics, sweeping executive power, and arguments that democracy itself is failing. Both sides are converging on the same grim conclusion. The system is broken beyond repair. When that sentiment becomes mainstream, when moderates lose influence and extremes gain followers, that's the moment Stage 5 begins. And the U.S. is closer to that moment than most people realize. Stage 6. The collapse of the existing order. This is the stage no society wants to reach. In France, it meant the terror. In Russia, it meant civil war and famine. In Cuba, it meant 6 decades of dictatorship. Every revolution promises liberation. Every revolution ends with new chains. American exceptionalism insists it can't happen here. But France thought the same. Russia thought the same. Cuba thought the same. The pattern doesn't care about national myths. If a breakdown ever occurred in the United States, it wouldn't necessarily look like past revolutions. It might not be guillotines or stormed palaces. It could be fragmentation, political paralysis, contested authority, institutional gridlock, and social upheaval instability instead of outright collapse. Systems can fall apart, not with an explosion, but with a slow, grinding unraveling. That's Stage 6. And once a society reaches Stage 4, history shows that stopping the downward slide becomes incredibly hard. 3 revolutions, 3 different nations, 3 identical patterns. France in 1789 and Russia in 1917, Cuba in 1959. Each time, the elite believed they were safe. Each time, they ignored the warning signs. Each time, the pressure built until the system broke. Today, the United States shows versions of the same indicators. Inequality approaching French Revolution levels. Government dysfunction reminiscent of Latimperial Russia. Institutional distrust similar to pre-Castro Cuba. None of this guarantees collapse. History warns it doesn't dictate. Reform is possible. Renewal is possible. Course correction is possible, but only if the problems are confronted rather than denied, and only if the nation chooses to fix the system before frustration overwhelms it. If this helped you understand the historical patronage where America stands within its, because if the trend continues, and if Stage 5 begins, the key to navigating what comes next is understanding how we got here in the first place. The answers aren't hidden in the future. They're written in the past. If you want to see the patterns the elites don't want you to notice, hit subscribe because understanding their game is the only way to stay ahead. Thank you for watching.